camera's running.
Right, are you ready, Steve?
I'm ready, yeah.
Good.
There are many moments in my life when I think this is very strange. One of the most bizarre things that happened to me happened in the 1990s when Russia first took part in the Eurovision Song Contest. I was being given a tour of Russian state television and wandered into a studio where they were rehearsing for that evening's Song for Europe. And I got talking to the director and told him I liked Eurovision. He said, "Oh, well, come back this evening, you can co-present the program." I thought, okay.
Сотрудник компании, подданной Британии, Стивен Розенберг.
Добрый вечер.
Добрый вечер. Стивен, как в Англии относятся к конкурсу песни Евровидения?
В Англии очень любят.
Things like that happened in the 1990s. There was this buzz in the studio, and it felt like, after the fall of communism, Russia was now part of this European family, and we were going to do great things together. And the world was going to be a better place and a safer place and a happier place. I mean, you know, when you're young, you're completely full of hope and optimism. And it just didn't work out. Since Vladimir Putin came to power, Russia has become a very different country.
Выстрел!
It felt as if this huge black cloud had come over. Russia had taken a very dark path.
Simply calling it a war can lead to 15 years behind bars.
Я же ничего не делал!
We've seen journalists detained, arrested, put on trial. No one is protected from prosecution.
Virtually all of the independent media in Russia has closed down. Many journalists have already left the country.
I would never criticize any reporter for having left Moscow. But living and working in Russia, trying to report on what's happening right now, does feel as if I'm walking this tightrope. I remain fascinated by Russia and want to know how this is going to end. Every year, in December, there is one event which goes on for 4 or 5 hours. Vladimir Putin, live on television, answering questions, and there's no guarantee that you get a question. But you need to prepare for it, because if you do get an opportunity, you want to make it count. So I go and try and practice the question, so under my breath, walking up and down. And it has to be like a decent question, right? Otherwise, there's no point asking it. You don't want to ask, what is your favorite color, Mr. President?
Yes, хорошо, попробуем. Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
The thing is that some of the questions that Vladimir Putin gets asked are not difficult for him to answer.
Вы счастливый человек?
Как я вам скажу?
They're really sort of puff questions.
О чем вы мечтаете?
Есть, конечно, но это же личная мечта. Можно я оставлю ее про себя?
But I think it's important to ask a serious question and get a serious answer.
BBC я обещал, да, пожалуйста.
Ровно 25 лет назад Борис Николаевич Ельцин ушел в отставку, передал вам власть и сказал вам: берегите Россию. что мы видим? Мы видим значительные потери в так называемой СТО, которую вы объявили. Санкции, высокая инфляция, демографические проблемы. Как вы считаете, вы уберегли свою страну?
Да, я считаю, что не просто уберег, я считаю, что мы отошли от края пропасти.
The interesting thing about his answer was he was defending his time in power.
Я сделал все для того, чтобы Россия была самостоятельной, суверенной державой.
But it's what happens after the press conference that I think gives a really interesting insight into what's happening in Russia.
Стив.
Как преподнесете материал, как вам ответ?
You're pounced upon by a string of Russian television crews.
Ответ на ваш вопрос полностью покажете на вашем телеканале?
There's this sense of paranoia.
Вы знаете, будет новостной сюжет.
One crew accused me of asking a provocative question.
То есть это просто была провокация, правильно?
You don't want to say anything that could be edited, clipped up in a way to reflect an anti-Russian bias. So you have to think very carefully what you're going to say.
Это нормальный журналистский вопрос.
I said I wasn't asking a provocative question. I asked a normal journalistic question. You know, I don't simply repeat the official line. I try to question it. That's what journalists do.
Ну, а почему такого формата в Великобритании нет?
I get the feeling that they want to paint Western journalists as Russophobes, as Russia haters.
Вы любите Россию? Конечно, люблю Россию. Давно любите Россию. Что вам в России?
I find it upsetting.
Очень любите Россию.
I don't hate the country. I've lived in Russia more than half my life. I fell in love with the country. It couldn't be further from the truth.
Но любите Россию. Что вам в России?
But the view presented by the Russian state media is that Western journalists are just here to undermine the Russian state. And it's a very powerful message and a very powerful weapon.
Я думаю, что
The sound of war has reverberated around Ukraine for 3 years. Overnight, Russia's largest drone attack yet hit the capital.
Residential buildings, shops and cafes were hit.
A record 267 Russian drones were launched in one night.
We're talking about peace. We have either a ceasefire or a peace itself, and we're looking to do both.
The year began with a sense that Donald Trump wanted to reboot relations with Russia and bring Vladimir Putin in from the cold.
The two men had a 90-minute phone call reversing years of US isolation of the Russian leader.
We had this telephone call between Trump and Putin.
Mr. Trump described it as a highly productive conversation.
Morning.
Morning.
How's your weekend?
All right, not too bad. You?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks.
I'm Ben Taverner. I'm a producer in the Moscow bureau. Most days, the Kremlin calls us in for a conference call to President Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov.
Можно уточнить, был ли этот первый телефонный разговор Путина и Трампа после переизбрания?
We wanted to ask this senior Kremlin official, Mr. Peskov, whether he thought this telephone call between Trump and Putin would lead to some kind of an agreement to end the war.
И настолько важен вот был этот разговор в глазах Кремля. Спасибо.
Нам гораздо больше импонирует позиция нынешней администрации, и мы открыты для диалога.
Vladimir Putin's press secretary seemed to suggest that both Washington and Moscow were keen to completely revamp their relationship.
There was a real sense of, wow, things are going to change. And perhaps this year we're going to be documenting the end of the war.
So we wanted to get out of Moscow and see what Russians were thinking and feel the mood.
So we decided to go about 100 miles to the north to a town called Tver.
All we wanted to do was to go around the town asking people what they thought about the prospects for peace. Nothing controversial. But you have to be constantly aware that anything could happen at any moment, just when you're least expecting it. The police pitched up and wanted to know what we're doing.
О чем?
О жизни, что люди думают. Вот. Сейчас большие изменения. Сейчас Трамп там в Америке.
In those situations, you have to remember relations between Russia and the West and Russia and Britain are pretty tense.
Долго вы будете находиться здесь?
So it's important to stay calm. You don't want to start running up and down the street shouting, "I'm doing nothing wrong, how dare you come up to us?" And you have to explain that you have all the documentation, all the accreditation you need, and to remain civil and polite.
У вас какая должность? Там написано, нет?
You hope that it's just going to be an identity check. But of course, we've seen much worse happen to people in the last few years.
Объяснение-то взять, когда закончите работать?
Объяснение?
And then, miraculously, the local state TV crew turned up.
Скажите, пожалуйста, вот снимаем происшествие в городе, ехали мимо, смотрим, полиция, что-то, коллеги вы наши. А что произошло?
Obviously, they'd been told to come and check us out as well, I think.
Мы ехали абсолютно мимо. Я еще раз говорю, занимаемся происшествием.
Мы сейчас общались с людьми на улице, но вам это разрешается.
Не, у нас страна свободная, у нас страна свободная.
Но вы подошли, полиция стоит около машины, а так все нормально.
I did point out to the correspondent that you talk about press freedom and yet the police have come to investigate what we're doing. That didn't seem to kind of register with him, yeah.
Спасибо вам большое за беседу. Пойдем побеседуем с сотрудниками полиции, узнаем, что же все-таки произошло.
Мы уже побеседовали, да.
Спасибо большое.
You know, we'd barely been in the town for half an hour when we're being asked to justify our presence there. It makes you think twice about the surveillance that's happening in Russia.
Certainly over the last 10 years, I'd say, regularly, when we've gone out of Moscow, there have been cases where clearly we've been followed and the same figures appear at the street corners watching you.
Я заметил, что вы следуете за нами несколько дней. И почему? Нет, не показалось, это точно. А почему? Вы откуда?
You can't relax, really, for a second. You want to report accurately and as honestly about what's happening, but you don't want to fall off the tightrope onto the minefield below and hit a mine, you know. And there are lots of mines you could hit. Of course, journalists are not the only foreigners in Russia to have close encounters with the authorities. So I went to visit the British ambassador to Moscow. He lives in an incredible residence right opposite the Kremlin.
That's quite a view. This is the view I wake up to in the morning. Yeah, it's quite something, isn't it? Apparently Stalin was desperate to get us out. He was convinced we were sort of beaming radio waves into the Kremlin. But despite his efforts and some others since then, we're still here.
Do you get the feeling you're being watched on a daily basis?
Well, if you do ever go out on the balcony, you definitely feel that, yes. Yes.
This hostility towards the UK from the authorities, how does that affect your work as British ambassador here?
Well, it has obviously made it much more difficult in a practical sense. People are literally scared of meeting us. I've noticed even in my 2 years here, the number of people who are willing to meet me has shrunk.
I mean, I don't know if you can talk about it or not, but when we travel outside of Moscow, very often we sense there are people sort of following us or keeping an eye on us. Would that be the same for...
Oh, yes, yeah, no. We assume that by one means or another, people are following our movements and who we're talking to and what we're up to.
Of course, looking back over the last few decades, there have been moments of tension, high tension between Russia and the West, Britain and Russia. But that tension went off the scale, really, 4 years ago.
Ukraine has imposed martial law as Russia officially begins its military invasion of the country.
The onslaught began just before dawn with a barrage of missiles.
I got a call very early in the morning on the 24th of February to say Putin's on television, he's making this big speech.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
There were reports of large numbers of Russian soldiers crossing the border into Ukraine. And it was at that point that it really hit me, like a punch to the face, the enormity of what had happened, and that things would not be the same again.
The Kremlin is trying to control discontent over the war. At least 8,000 protesters have been arrested.
Then the authorities passed a series of repressive laws, criminalizing so-called dissemination of fake news.
Simply calling it a war can lead to 15 years behind bars.
These laws were used to detain and prosecute people who were criticizing the authorities and the war.
Tonight, many Russian journalists are fearing for their safety. Some have already fled the country this week.
My name is Anne Simmons, and I was the Moscow bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. There was an obvious decrease in the number of foreign journalists working in Russia following the invasion of Ukraine.
Foreign journalists are being forced to basically shut up their bureaus and either leave or simply cease reporting.
At that time, the Wall Street Journal had decided that we would stay put, but many companies decided that rather than take a chance, remain in the country and have their reporters subjected to possible detention or harassment, they would remove their reporters.
Dozens and dozens of people working for BBC Russian took the decision to pull out of Moscow and move to Riga and London. And suddenly, the office became very empty. 4 or 5 years ago, you would have seen a bustling newsroom, buzzing. It was the Russian service broadcasting in Russian to a Russian audience, and that put them at particular risk in terms of the Russian authorities. So they've moved out of Moscow. I was broadcasting in English to an audience outside of Russia, so I calculated that perhaps would have been perceived less of a threat by the authorities. And so we stayed. Yes, of course, all kinds of things go through your head. Nobody knew what was going to happen from hour to hour.
The arrest of a journalist is having a chilling effect on the few Western reporters who remain inside of Russia.
Evan Gershkovich, arrested on spying charges.
When I realized that it was my Wall Street Journal colleague, Evan, that was the worst day of my life. You don't want any of your colleagues to be harmed, and you certainly don't want any of your colleagues to be detained. Evan had gone to the city of Yekaterinburg in southern Russia to report a story. But the Russians were saying that Evan was gathering information about some kind of military installations, and so therefore they accused him of spying.
Под прикрытием журналистской деятельности, визы журналистской аккредитации, человек, судя по проведенным мероприятиям, и им, и в отношении него, он занимался совершенно иной деятельностью.
Of course, that allegation is completely false. There was no way I would have even guessed at that time that he would have spent 16 months in a Russian prison.
As soon as I saw Evan in that cage, Yeah, I realised that that could happen to any Western journalist. It was a reminder that we were operating in a dangerous situation. Suddenly, I found myself trying to feel my way through a distorted reality. Everything is very unclear. You're not sure where the danger lies, what's going to happen next. And it still feels as if the red lines keep changing.
No journalist is completely safe in Russia today. If you say the wrong thing, if you cross the line that the Kremlin doesn't like, you could be easily detained, deported, intimidated.
Today, due to the present situation, we have just 5 members of staff for news gathering in Russia. And because we're such a small team, it's tough sometimes.
No, that's not right. No, this isn't right.
The G3 must be around.
Since the start of the war, the freedom to do independent journalism has changed. I mean, it's the job of a journalist, isn't it, to go up to people, to ask their opinion. But one of the biggest problems we face now is getting people to speak to us. People are worried about speaking to the BBC, and that's a reflection of the situation we're in, this tension between Russia and the West.
If he runs away, ask him, why are you running away? I think.
Can I ask you a quick question? No.
This famous Russian political scientist told me to go to hell.
I just wanted to ask how concerned Russia is. So, that was Fyodor Lukyanov, a Russian political scientist who, in years gone by, very often gave interviews to the BBC, but clearly has no interest, right, in giving any more interviews to the BBC. Some people feel that
it's not worth it.
It's not worth the risk.
Every day we're faced with challenges. How on earth do we tell that story? How do you get that point of view through? And you have to find ways around it. As difficult as it is now reporting in Russia, there are still places to go to understand what the leadership is thinking.
So we're about to fly 1,000 miles to the north.
To the Arctic Forum in Murmansk.
A room with a view. Found it.
When the Arctic Forum happened in Murmansk, that was a point where a lot of people were getting very excited about the potential for new deals between Russia and America.
The White House talked about the need for improved bilateral relations between the United States and Russia. It said there are enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability to play for.
So we wanted to see what Russian officials were saying about America and about the prospects of cooperation with Washington in the Arctic. And in Murmansk, there was a very powerful figure, former head of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, someone I have really wanted to speak to for like 20 years, someone who's never agreed to give an interview to me. So I had to chase him. I'm not the tallest person in the world, and it wasn't easy to get close to him. It seemed as if it's not going to happen. But if you want to get some comment from someone, and they walk away from you, walk in their direction, and just keep going.
BBC, можно сказать, это строится новый мировой порядок сейчас в пользу России.
Sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't. Mostly it doesn't. But there are occasions when it does work out.
А вы удивлены скоростью разворота США по отношению к России, к Украине, к Европе? Потому что многие комментаторы на Западе пометили, что многие высокопоставленных лиц США повторяют позицию Кремля сейчас.
Вы знаете, США – народ, и у него есть свое представление. Есть две партии, которые между собой соревнуются – республиканцы и демократы. Их между собой отношения антагонистические. Когда были демократы у власти, у них одни были представления. Когда республиканцы, у них свои представления. Это не значит...
Nikolai Patrushev was saying the Trump administration has an opposing view to the Democrats, which just happens to be a more positive one about Russia.
И это не значит, что они придерживаются тех точек зрения, которые имеют Россия. Нет, у них свои представления, они их продвигают, и мы можем с ними сотрудничать.
Спасибо. Спасибо. It wasn't a full-scale interview, but it was interesting to hear from a man who is very close to Vladimir Putin. Even though he was couching it in very cautious language, Moscow saw that in the White House, now there is a US president who wants a better relationship with Moscow. Russia saw an opportunity here.
And that was interesting, because it was a time when Donald Trump had mentioned about acquiring Greenland.
President Trump has been saying he wants to take control of Greenland as US territory, and he's refused to rule out using force.
I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
There'd been a lot of international criticism of Donald Trump for the comments he'd made about Greenland.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
And so at the Arctic Forum, you could feel the sense of expectation ahead of Putin's big keynote address.
Все об этом хорошо знают, о планах Соединенных Штатов Америки по присоединению Гренландии.
Putin just made the point of, we're not going to get in the way.
Что касается Гренландии, это вопрос, который касается двух конкретных государств и к нам не имеет никакого отношения. Спасибо вам большое за внимание.
I think the message to Donald Trump was, geopolitically, what you do is your business, and we're not going to interfere. And the subtext of that is, don't interfere with what we're doing, with what Russia's doing, in our backyard. So it seemed to play into this sense that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump were building this new relationship, and it was all positive, it was all very complimentary.
When you're ready, my friend.
Moscow has been talking up the idea of economic cooperation. Towards the end of the trip to Murmansk, when we were filming on the street, we got the sense that we were being watched.
И не только туристов.
It's moments like this that you get the feeling you're being followed. This chap has been hanging around us for a good 10 minutes or so, clearly filming us, I think. Just another reminder, I think, to us that there's a lot of suspicion, certainly amongst the authorities, towards Western journalists. But it's interesting to see what their reaction is when you start filming them back. Oh, off he goes, as soon as I start talking about him. And very soon he disappeared off into a car and was gone.
Dozens of kamikaze drones in the early hours this morning, spreading their devastation and destruction.
After this kind of hope that the war will end, things took a very different turn.
Russia keeps launching such attacks even when the whole world is calling on it to stop.
It was very difficult to cover it. because things kept flip-flopping. At one point, it looked as if Donald Trump was starting to put pressure on Moscow for a quick peace deal.
We want to see it end. And I'm disappointed in President Putin because I thought we would have had a deal 2 months ago, but it doesn't seem to get there.
And then suddenly he changed, and the deadlines came and went, and no, there was no pressure.
All talk of a ceasefire seems to have stopped.
We started putting back into our minds the idea that this war could take a lot longer to resolve.
Then suddenly, something happened that came completely out of the blue.
We have some breaking news to bring to you now.
President Trump says he'll meet his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, next week.
This is very unlike Vladimir Putin, right? To suddenly drop everything and run off abroad for a meeting. But it looks like it's happening. And we were thinking, well, where are we going to go?
The leaders are expected to meet on Friday in Alaska.
The Alaska summit comes after months of phone calls and meetings.
And suddenly we were in panic stations. Just a week away. We had to find out how we get there, get all of our equipment there. Got on 3 different flights over the course of 2 days. And eventually we landed in Anchorage.
5 days ago, I did not expect to be standing by a stuffed Alaskan polar bear covering this story.
Welcome to Alaska.
President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin are set to meet today at a U.S. military base in Anchorage, Alaska.
Is he up?
Yes. Yeah, he is. What's going to happen today, I've absolutely no idea. But at least we'll be there where the action's happening.
Sorry.
Are you with Russian media?
With the Russian media.
Okay, you need to check in down here, please.
And thank you.
Good. No filming right now, guys. Thank you.
If it's a bad meeting, it'll end very quickly. And if it's a good meeting, we're going to end up getting peace in the pretty near future.
So this is where the press conference is going to be, right? It's interesting, look, they've already got a slogan. So that must mean they are confident of agreeing on something. Well, there's another.
Russian commentators are calling the meeting historic, with some describing the meeting as a symbolic end to Putin's isolation in the West.
It's very warm, isn't it?
Yes, pat on the arm.
Pat on the arm.
Is that a pat on the arm back?
Yes, there was a pat on the arm back.
The optics suggested that the bromance was continuing, and these are 2 leaders who want to get on and are ready to do a deal.
Those crucial talks are underway now, and we should find out in a few hours' time whether the fighting in Ukraine might be about to end.
It's nice to meet you, finally, after all this time.
It's coming out of the bubble that we exist in Russia. We meet colleagues who we don't usually get to meet, and that's nice, to actually interact with people.
What do you make of it? I mean,
it's bizarre, isn't it? Because we've absolutely no idea what's going on in there, or what time we're going to have a press conference, if we're going to have a press conference.
And it's nice to remind myself, I'm not just alone.
Very nice, that's nice.
We expected the talks to go on for hours and hours.
Right, I've got to get something to eat.
Yeah.
I'm fading fast.
We were settling in for a 6-hour wait. But I think about 2.5 hours in, suddenly one of the Russian journalists said, "It's happening." So everybody just bolted back into the press conference hall, and we tried to find, the best seats possible. And there happened to be 2 empty seats on the front row.
So we don't know yet how these talks have gone, but we do know that the Kremlin is predicting that they would last maybe 6 or 7 hours. They haven't.
It lasted maybe half that time, so I don't know if we can read anything into that. We'll have to wait for their statements.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States of America and the President of the Russian Federation.
You could feel the sense of expectation, the buzz. Everyone waiting to find out what Putin and Trump had agreed in their talks.
Уважаемый господин президент, дамы и господа, наши переговоры прошли в конструктивной и взаимоуважительной атмосфере.
Vladimir Putin gave no sense in his statement that he was prepared to make any compromise.
Мы видим стремление администрации США и лично президента Трампа содействовать разрешению украинского конфликта.
There were many points that we agreed on, most of them I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite got there.
Donald Trump had wanted Russia to sign up to an unconditional ceasefire, and it became very clear that Vladimir Putin hadn't agreed to that. And then after the two statements from the two presidents, that's it. End of event. No questions, no press conference, and they leave the stage. And you could feel the shock amongst the journalists. You know, this hum, this buzz of what on earth's going on?
It's another stalling tactic from Russia. Are you playing for time?
Nobody would speak to us. They wouldn't utter a word to us. And we just looked at each other and said, well, what was that? But there should be a wider...
Because we expected, a wider meeting of the delegations, but...
I think the Alaska summit did trigger alarm bells in Kiev, because Donald Trump went into that summit intending to get Vladimir Putin to stop the fighting. But afterwards, Donald Trump wasn't talking about a ceasefire anymore. He was repeating the Russian narrative, calling for a final peace deal. And as far as the Kremlin is concerned, that deal should be on Russia's terms.
When I'm going back to Russia, on the one hand, I'm excited because I'm eager to find out what's going to happen next. But there's always that thought at the back of my head, what's going to happen, when you arrive. I think it's only when you come out of Russia that you realize how much stress there is actually. The political situation, the military situation sometimes feels as if we're on some kind of, nuclear submarine a long way from shore. And, something goes wrong, there's not a lot that people on the shore can do to kind of help us. It feels quite lonely out there. But I mean, I want to go back because it's a country that I, fell in love with a long time ago.
I grew up in Chingford in London, and I think the first time I came across Russia was when the BBC broadcast a Russian language TV series in 1980. And I sat there transfixed.
Здравствуйте. 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 Здравствуйте.
Здравствуйте.
Здравствуйте. Hello.
I fell in love with the language. It was a lovely language. I started visiting Russia in 1987. And this was a time when Russia was in the news and this mysterious country, the Soviet Union, was suddenly opening up to the world. In 1991, I went to Moscow to teach English. And a few months later, the Soviet Union fell apart. Complete drama, totally unexpected. And there was such excitement in the country. For me, it was the start of an incredible adventure, And by the mid-1990s, I was working as a journalist in Moscow, and I got a call out of the blue. And it was from someone asking me to take part in a comedy show, of all things, The White Parrot, on Russian state TV.
Представляю вам всем Стив Розенберг.
That is one of the most happy memories I have of the last 30 years.
Наше заседание клуба «Белый попугай» будет посвящено английскому.
It was set in this pub in Moscow with Russian TV stars telling each other jokes about Britain, sort of English humour.
Доктор, через 59 секунд я умру. Подождите минуту.
There was this great atmosphere of friendship, and I really felt it. And I remember they said, would you sing something British? And that's the first thing that came to mind, Daisy Daisy, which doesn't say a lot about my musical taste, does it? But actually, thinking back, that's how I felt at the time. You know, Russia and Britain, Russia and the West were like on this bicycle made for two.
But you look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle made for two.
But when I think back to the 1990s, I can't help feeling sad, because fast forward to today, and it's a very different time.
I've just sent you a link. Gotta watch this. The driver saw this on Russian TV.
Solovyov?
Yep.
А мы до сих пор не уничтожили ни Лондон, ни Бирмингем. Мы не стерли с лица земли всю эту британскую мразь. Мы не выгнали отсюда гребаное BBC со Стивом Ротенбергом, который ходит с лицом какающей белочки и постоянно удивляется. А что он здесь делает?
TV show host said, why haven't we kicked out the BBC? Why haven't we kicked out Steve Rosenberg?
Чьи интересы он обслуживает? Объективной журналистики, не смешите меня. Он был объективным журналистом 20 лет назад. Сейчас он осознанный враг нашей страны.
I mean, I don't know what a defecating squirrel looks like, but I'm certainly not an enemy of Russia.
Что происходит?
I don't go on air saying things about him. I will now. No, I won't. With the BBC.
I think we don't rise to it.
No, with the BBC we have... No. I'll try to be zen.
But that's not nice when you hear yourself described as an enemy of Russia.
What a cheek.
Steve's shown on state TV regularly as a propagandist from Britain.
В Новосибирск приехала съемочная группа британского телеканала BBC. Нам стало известно.
I'm the obnoxious British reporter Steve Rosenberg.
Мне кажется, некрасиво тогда, когда ваша телекомпания показывает фильм о нашем президенте, о нашей стране.
Sometimes it gets quite personal.
You are shaping the perception. And the perception that Russia is guilty. That's what you are doing. And this is propaganda. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to say this. You are a piece of propaganda.
Hello, Steve. Question from Sputnik News. Why hasn't the BBC reported on Ukrainian war crimes in Kursk?
For some reason, the Russian authorities wouldn't allow us to go down to Kursk.
Steve is one of the very few international journalists that regular Russians can actually put a face to a name. He's on state TV all the time.
Propagandist BBC, Steve Rosenberg.
It's a daily staple program. They look at the bulletins that have gone out, they look at what Steve said, and they try and cherry pick certain lines completely out of context to try and prove that there's some kind of conspiracy against Russia.
Of course, this messaging that you hear on Russian state television doesn't automatically turn all Russians into haters of the West, but it's full on. And these kind of ideas have been projected by the Russian state media for some time now. And it does affect how some people think. Has reappeared.
You have to remember that there are people that support Vladimir Putin and his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And more than that, some of them are willing to put their lives on the line. And I think it's important we try and show that. One sequence that we wanted to film in Vladivostok was with a para ice hockey team made up of war veterans, Russians that fought in Ukraine, local people that are all amputees. But members of the military aren't allowed to speak to the media. There's an absolute ban on that. So I was pretty relieved by the time we got there to see that actually they were willing to talk to us. In this case, it was a gentleman that was mobilized into the Russian army, had fought in Ukraine, lost a leg, and is now no longer a member of the military, which was why he was allowed to speak to us.
Что именно с вами случилось, когда вы получили ранение?
Мина прилетела сверху. Да. Я упал такой. Странно, ногу сжег. Смотрю, там все разворотило, я зажгутовался. Меня там долго бинтовали, пытались ногу восстановить. Вот, ну, в госпиталь пока везли. А у меня жена хирург. Я ей фотографии сделал ноги. Она такая, ну, отпилят, скорее всего. Я говорю, ну ладно. Она врач, для нее это нормально. Да.
One of the things that shocked me was the matter-of-fact way he talked about his injuries, as if nothing major had happened.
Сколаживается воспоминания, память того времени.
Да, я не знаю. Я не особо и страдал в то время, поэтому я в целом позитивный.
Понятно.
It was quite a challenging experience because there was his human story about how he'd been injured. But of course, I had to remind myself that these servicemen had been part of an invasion force, right? Russia had invaded Ukraine.
Насколько важно вот понятие как победа и в спорте, и в жизни, и на фронте?
Она неизбежна, она будет, и мы ее приближали, и после нас ее будут приближать. Поэтому я думаю, это неизбежно.
Journalists interview many people. Do we agree with the views of all the people we interview? No, we don't. But if we don't interview people we don't agree with and we just shut ourselves off, that doesn't help so much our understanding, I think, of the situation.
Наше дело правое, враг будет разбит, победа будет за нами. Честь имею.
Part of the reason some people believe that Russia's doing the right thing is that the Russians are told that Russia's war against Ukraine is a just war, a war started by the West, even though it was Russia that launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and that Russia is liberating Ukraine instead of seizing territory.
Владимир Путин вручил государственные награды бойцам, проходящим лечение в госпитале Вишневского. Главнокомандующий прибыл туда вместе с министром обороны.
It is having an impact on the population. People who may not have a VPN to log on to outside sources of news will say this is the reason why we need to be defending ourselves by, going into Ukraine because the West wants to use Ukraine against Russia. The worldview is that right now, Europe is an enemy of Russia.
Но если Европа вдруг захочет с нами воевать и начнет, мы готовы прямо сейчас.
We're entering right now, I think, a dangerous period for Europe because the Kremlin can see changes in the geopolitical situation. America, under Donald Trump, is super critical of the European Union.
We will actually, for real, get our allies and partners to step up and do their part. We will no longer tolerate free riding. Allies that still fail to do their part for collective defense will face consequences.
There are people who question whether Donald Trump is fully committed to America within NATO. And a NATO without America isn't really NATO. So it's a dangerous cocktail for Europe and for the world.
So what, it's 7:50 in the morning, and we're off to Vladimir Putin's end-of-year press conference again. There's no guarantee we'll get a question, but I hope I do, because, I mean, it's been quite a year. Well, his spokesman yesterday said that he'd be prepared to speak for 6.5 hours.
As far as Russia is concerned, this is a major event. But you have to be aware that in an increasingly authoritarian system, the format lends itself to the Kremlin being in control of the message. And so, to a large extent, it's a choreographed event.
Мы начинаем. Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Путин.
But you can be there and not just be a propaganda tool of the authorities.
BBC, Великобритания, да? Задайте ваш вопрос, пожалуйста.
And so, with all this tension swirling around and a sort of saber rattling off the scale now between Russia and the West, I wanted to ask the president how he sees Russia's future.
Какое будущее вы планируете, вы строите для своей страны? Будет ли усиливаться еще поиск врагов и внешних, и внутренних? Будут ли еще новые специальные военные операции? Спасибо.
Не будет никаких операций, если вы будете относиться к нам с уважением. Будете соблюдать наши интересы, так же, как и мы постоянно пытались соблюдать ваши. Если вы не будете нас надувать, как надули с расширением НАТО на восток.
Interestingly, Vladimir Putin said, no, there won't be more special military operations as long as you respect Russia, which raises the question, well, what if he believes that the West is not respecting Russia enough? Then what follows is there will be more special military operations, perhaps.
Вы создали, не вы лично, конечно, западные политические деятели создали сегодняшнюю ситуацию своими руками и продолжают нагнетать обстановку. Постоянно говорят о том, что они готовятся к войне с Россией.
Vladimir Putin doesn't believe that he can be a partner with the current crop of European leaders. And he can see that Europe is in a difficult position right now because ideologically, Europe seems far apart from the Trump administration. And that is helping to fuel, I think, the Kremlin's confidence at this moment. Putin has gone for broke to try to turn the tables and change the European security infrastructure. He's crossed a big Rubicon, and it's hard to see him going back now the other way.
Спасибо вам большое за совместную работу.
Спасибо вам огромное.
I would love the opportunity to interview Vladimir Putin. But even with one question and one answer, that tells you something, I think, about the person giving the answer. And it's a reminder of why we think it's vitally important to hang on and continue my reporting from Russia.
How long was that? 4.5 then, was it?
It was about 4.5 hours, right? Yeah. Russia's the biggest country in the world. It's got a massive nuclear arsenal. So we need to understand what the leadership is thinking and doing and what Russians, I think, are thinking and doing, especially now at a time of heightened tension between Russia and the West.
At least 4 people have been killed in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, after a night of intense Russian airstrikes across Ukraine.
It was the most intensive night of Russian bombing since the turn of the year.
It's easy to be pessimistic when you look at what's happening to Russia. But I remain optimistic that things will change for the better. Because if you look at what's happened, going back over the decades, Russia has swung between periods of terrible dictatorship to periods of thaw, of democratization, and back again. So history teaches us that as difficult as things seem in the moment, life will change and go in a different direction. It's this double-headed eagle situation, the Russian national symbol. One head is growling and barking and calling you a defecating squirrel, and the other head is smiling and wanting to take a selfie with you. It's not a case that all Russians support the war. Being here, I think, allows us to show there's nuance.
Можно вас спросить? BBC Москва.
Most of the interactions I have with Russians on the streets are positive. I've met, in 30 years, so many warm, friendly people.
It's little encounters like this that makes it worthwhile being here. You know? Just little things like this.
And it's these interactions with people that give me hope that, as awful as the last 4 years have been, that actually when we get through this, there will be a basis to restore some kind of a relationship with Russia. However, I don't kid myself. I have no illusions that this could end tomorrow. There are lots of things that could knock you off the tightrope if you don't keep calm, but I want to carry on. It's not about courage or bravery. Courage doesn't come into it, I don't think, really. I remain fascinated by Russia and want to know how this is going to end.